In a remote time, Rome was just one among many Italian cities, a fortified hill among countless others. At first, its eyes could see no farther than Latium. It was a city turned inward, concerned with local rivalries, tribal traditions, and the ongoing conflict between patricians and plebeians. But like a seed refusing to accept the limits of the pot in which it was born, Rome began to grow. It grew outward, beyond its geography, its original politics, and above all, beyond its identity. And it was in this movement of continuous expansion that Rome ceased to be merely Rome, no longer a city but an idea, a project, a world. This is how the provinces Kachaikas were born, conquered territories that would be administered not as separate nations, but as parts of the Roman body itself, even if they didn't always feel the same blood pulsing through them. The word province, provincia in Latin, did not initially refer to a geographic land with fixed borders. Above all, it meant a task assigned to a Roman magistrate, a mission. A province was therefore first and foremost a political function, which only later would be transformed into territory. It was as if every portion of the conquered world was, at first, a delegated responsibility, a provisional extension of the arm of the Republic. But these functions became permanent, and the territories took root. Sicily was the first formally created province right after the First Punic War around 241 before Christ. From that moment, Rome understood that it was not enough to win. One had to govern, and to govern meant adapting to a new reality, the empire. The birth of the provinces coincided with the emergence of a new identity for Rome. Until then, citizenship had been a privilege exclusive to the Italian peninsula, and even there, highly hierarchical. Conquered peoples were initially treated as subordinates, and their lands as sources of tribute and soldiers. But as the empire expanded, so too grew the need for loyalty. Rome began to grant, albeit gradually, civil rights and access to the imperial administrative structure. The project was ambitious, to transform diverse peoples into functional parts of a single body. And in a way it worked, but not without tension, revolt, or bloodshed. The provinces also became political laboratories. The Senate and the people of Rome, with their consuls and tribunes, could no longer manage a territory that stretched across thousands of kilometers. It was necessary to create a new system in which each province would have a Roman governor, usually drawn from the senatorial or equestrian aristocracy. These governors, called proconsuls or propraetors, held civil, judicial, and military authority, representing Rome in foreign lands as if they were temporary little emperors. And with them came taxes, Roman laws, the Latin language, and inevitably the conflicts between what was imposed and what already existed. However, Rome did not crush all difference. On the contrary, it learned to absorb without erasing. It allowed local religions to coexist with the Roman pantheon, respected puppet kings as long as they remained loyal, and accepted diverse languages and customs as long as tribute was paid and order maintained. This strategic flexibility turned the provinces into complex mosaics, places where Romanness was a veneer over ancient identities, a mask of power that did not completely erase the face beneath it, and sometimes that mask would fall. Over time, the number of provinces grew drastically. By the turn of the millennium, under the rule of Count Augustus, the first emperor, Rome already controlled over 30 provinces spread across 3 continents. From that point on, Rome was no longer just a city. Rome was the entire Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrums as they called it. It was the North African coast, where lions hunted under the gaze of legionaries. It was Iberia, with its silver mines. It was Gaul with its fertile fields. It was Judea with its prophets and revolts. It was Egypt with its gold, its grain, and its millennia-old gods. Each province was a piece of the new Rome, alive, pulsing, strained. And the heart of this colossal creature kept beating in the herbs, but its nerves and muscles were everywhere. This was the most radical turning point in Roman history, when it ceased to be a place and became a structure, when it ceased to be a people and became a system, when it ceased to be only Rome and became the Roman Empire, a political organism that would live for centuries still, sometimes stronger, sometimes on the brink of death, but always sustained by the veins of its provinces. Now that the empire breathes through every corner of the ancient world, It is time to understand how it governed this vastness. And so, in our next journey, we will walk through the gears of the system that supported this colossus, the intricate art of ruling from a distance. As Rome expanded beyond the borders of Italy, one question became inevitable: how to maintain control over an empire that stretched for thousands of kilometers, crossed deserts, mountains, and seas, and housed dozens of peoples, languages, and religions. Rome's answer was not simple, but it was ingenious. It created an administrative model as flexible as it was authoritarian, as decentralized in appearance as it was deeply centralized in essence. This model became the invisible pillar of the empire, what allowed provinces like Hispania, Egypt, and Syria to keep functioning even when emperors died, civil wars erupted, and disasters ravaged the capital. Governing from a distance was no improvisation. It was a science under constant refinement. Each province was administered by a governor, the highest Roman authority in that territory. However, this generic title concealed a much more complex political and hierarchical structure. Since Augustus's reforms, at the end of the 1st century before Christ, the empire had been divided into two major administrative categories: senatorial provinces and imperial provinces. In the former, authority came from the Senate; in the latter, directly from the emperor. This division was more than bureaucratic, it was a declaration of power. Senatorial provinces were generally pacified and stable, such as Achaia or Sicily. Imperial provinces were those with legions, risks of revolt or strategic importance. It was as if the emperor were saying, "These I handle myself." Governors of senatorial provinces were called proconsuls or propraetors, usually former high-ranking magistrates selected from among the most experienced senators. In the imperial provinces, the emperor appointed imperial legates, men of his direct trust, often with solid military careers. There was also the special case of Egypt, which, due to its wealth and symbolic weight, was governed by a praefectum of equestrian rank, not senatorial, as a way to keep Roman aristocrats away from a power that might feed dangerous ambitions. But the governor did not rule alone. Each province had a complex network of local magistrates, municipal councils, soldiers, tax collectors, scribes, engineers, interpreters, public slaves, and special envoys. The governor stood at the top of a pyramid that extended through every layer of the territory. He judged serious crimes, supervised public works, coordinated tax collection, ensured the worship of the gods, and maintained peace with the help of stationed legions, if necessary by the sword. Rome's fiscal system was one of its greatest tools of control. Its foundation was the tributum, the territorial tax collected annually from the provinces. To calculate it, Rome conducted regular censuses, recording property, wealth, and population. This allowed a detailed understanding of the provinces that would make even modern states envious. Collection was often carried out by private companies of tax collectors, the sult publicani, who paid Rome in advance and charged the locals with a certain degree of freedom, which frequently resulted in abuses. Over time, the empire gradually brought more direct control over this process, but the reputation for corruption never truly disappeared. Another key element of the model was the imperial road network, the Viae Romanae, which connected the provinces to the heart of the empire. These roads were more than commercial routes. They were channels for military, political, and administrative communication. Imperial couriers, the incursos, could cross hundreds of kilometers in just a few days, carrying orders, reports, and decrees. Rome had created a functional state infrastructure, capable of operating even at a distance, even under strain. And to keep watch over the watchers, the emperor relied on a silent and feared elite, the curatores, procurators, itinerant censors, and above all, imperial agents, true administrative spies. These men evaluated governors' conduct, denounced irregularities, and kept the emperor informed about everything happening in the distant corners of the Roman world. At any moment, a governor could be removed, judged, even executed for treason, mismanagement, or disloyalty. The long arm of Rome reached every part of the empire, even where its presence seemed most fragile. Behind this apparatus was a clear logic. The empire had to function like an organism, with autonomous organs, all subordinate to a single head, the emperor. And even in the most distant provinces, the symbol of that power was present. Imperial busts in public squares, coins stamped with his face, temples built in his honor. The emperor was the invisible axis that held together the dizzying diversity of Rome. This model was not immune to failure. There were abuses, revolts, bankruptcies, injustices, and brutal crackdowns, but there was also stability, prosperity, security, and a degree of administrative organization that would astonish the world for centuries. It was the art of ruling from afar and making it seem that everything was within arm's reach. Now that the administrative machinery has been laid bare, it is time to look behind the logic of center and periphery. In our next dive, we will explore the delicate symbolic hierarchy between Italy, the original Rome, and the provinces that surrounded her. A tension of privilege, memory, and inequality. In the vast body of the Roman Empire, not all limbs were equal. Though Rome prided itself on its grandeur and capacity for integration, the center and the periphery always pulsed to different rhythms. Italy, the empire's cradle and the guardian of its original identity, held a position of unmatched prestige. It was the heart of the imperial creature, and everything beyond its mountains and seas, the provinces, was long seen as an extension, but never an equal. To understand this distinction between Rome and the rest is to grasp not only the administrative structure of the empire, but also its deepest soul, how it saw itself and how it saw others. For centuries, Italians enjoyed civil, fiscal, and political privileges that other peoples of the empire did not. Italy was exempt from many direct taxes, did not have to sustain legions within its borders, and its citizens had privileged access to magistracies and political participation. It was a kind of sacred space, where the concept of Romanness was purer, more legitimate, more complete. To be Roman at the beginning was synonymous with being Italian, and that was no coincidence. Roman citizenship, until the 1st century before Christ, was strictly limited to inhabitants of the peninsula. The provinces, no matter how loyal or Romanized, were still foreigners at the heart of the Republic. This separation became even more evident with the rise of the administrative provinces. While Italians lived in autonomous cities directly connected to Rome, provincials lived under appointed governors, under local or adapted laws, in a system that made it clear, you are governed, we govern. Italy was a mosaic of municipia and colonies which, though diverse, shared a special status. The provinces, on the other hand, were conquered and exploited territories, often militarized and profoundly different from one another. Britain was not Syria. Numidia was not Asia. Each had its own treatment, its own wounds, its own agreements. But the empire did not remain static. The 1st century after Christ, especially under the emperors of the Julio-Claudian and Flavian dynasties, marked the beginning of a slow but irreversible change. Granting citizenship to provincials became a political tool. Entire cities were granted the status of municipium or colonia, giving them partial or full access to the rights of Roman citizens. This was the birth of the so-called other Romes, urban centers in the provinces that imitated the customs, institutions, and even the architecture of the capital. Temples, forums, public baths, theaters, and circuses arose as seeds of Romanness on foreign soil. Over time, Italy itself began to dissolve as a distinct unit. The civil wars at the end of the Republic, the centralization of power in the emperor, and the continuous expansion of citizenship caused the symbolic meaning of being Italian to fade. The height of this process came in 212 after Christ, when Emperor Hankazzi Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to almost all free inhabitants of the empire. With a single act, the Roman world ceased to be center and periphery, at least on paper, and became a unified space under the fiction of a shared citizenship. But the reality was more complex. Even though technically all were Romans, regional inequalities persisted. The senatorial elites remained largely Italian or direct descendants. Access to high positions in the empire was, to some extent, controlled by blood ties, patronage, and birth. Provinces could imitate Rome, but it would take centuries before they produced their own emperors, as we will later see with figures like Trajan, Hadrian, Septimius Severus. For many, Romanization was a one-way street. They adopted the language, customs, and laws, but seldom received the same recognition. This tension between center and periphery manifested not only in politics, but also in culture, religion, and architecture. While Rome was the model, the provinces adapted. A temple to Jupiter in Gaul might bear Celtic elements. A forum in Judea might coexist with Jewish rituals. A theater in Africa might host Roman tragedies spoken in Latin, but attended by people who dreamed in millennia-old tongues. The empire was one, but also deeply fragmented. Over the centuries, the capital itself began to feel the weight of this decentralization. The other Romes were growing. Cities like Carthage, Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople rivaled the Eternal City in symbolic and strategic importance. The frontier was becoming the new center. The empire, like an aging general, began to rely on border soldiers, distant governors, and the sons of the provinces. Rome was no longer just a place. It was a memory, a promise, and a nostalgia. That nostalgia, however, was supported by concrete structures, roads, taxes, military loyalties, language. But beneath all of that was the subtlest mechanism of all, cultural romanization. And that is what we will explore in our next journey, how Rome imposed its language, its gods, and its customs upon the world, and how, in doing so, it was also transformed. At first glance, the map of the Roman Empire appeared as a single body, an imposing territorial unity bordered by rivers, deserts, and seas. But beneath this uniform surface lay a sophisticated political engineering, where not all provinces answered to the same masters. After the birth of the Principate with Augustus in 27 before Christ, Rome adopted an administrative division that would endure for centuries. The separation between senatorial provinces and imperial provinces. It was as if the empire had two brains, one ancestral, represented by the Senate, and a new one, embodied in the figure of the emperor. The coexistence between these two powers was not merely institutional. It was a reflection of the rivalries, alliances, and tensions that defined power in Rome. Senatorial provinces were essentially regions deemed pacified, stable, and secure. They had no stationed legions and little military presence. These provinces were governed by Khan proconsuls, or Khan propraetors, elected by the Senate and drawn from the senatorial elite. Their mandates usually lasted 1 year, and they exercised civil and judicial authority, but not military power. These provinces were a symbolic inheritance from the Republican era, a gesture of respect to the old aristocratic system, even if stripped of real influence. Greece, Sicily, and proconsular Africa, lands of deep history and cultural weight, were classic examples of senatorial provinces. Imperial provinces, on the other hand, were under the direct control of the emperor. These were frontier regions, areas of unrest or of vital strategic or economic importance. They had permanently stationed legions, and their governors, known as legati Augusti pro praetore, were personally appointed by the emperor, often drawn from the equestrian order or his trusted inner circle. In these lands, the emperor's power was absolute, and his presence was felt even from afar. Gaul, Syria, Germania, Egypt, Britannia, all imperial provinces, fortified and constantly monitored. This division was not only functional, it was also a game of mirrors. The emperor pretended to respect the Senate, while the Senate pretended to govern. In practice, true power lay in the hands of the princeps, but maintaining the illusion of a republic was politically convenient. The division between provinces was therefore a political pact. The Senate retained the appearance of authority, while the emperor ensured order in the critical regions. It was an unstable symbiosis, dependent on a fragile balance between prestige and force. The case of Egypt deserves special attention. Unlike any other province, it was not considered part of the general empire. Egypt was the personal property of the emperor. No senator could enter Alexandria without express permission. Governed by an equestrian prefect, Egypt was the most sensitive jewel of the empire. Its grain fed Rome, its gold sustained imperial finances, and its gods fascinated even the Caesars. Augustus knew that to lose Egypt was to lose the empire, and so he kept it beyond the reach of any senatorial ambition. The provincial system also reflected the complexity of Romanization. In many imperial regions, contact with Roman power was brutal, immediate, and visible. Legions patrolled the roads, taxes were collected rigorously, and imperial temples were erected to reinforce the divine authority of the princeps. In the senatorial provinces, the process was more subtle, almost cultural. There, Roman identity was a legacy to be assimilated, not a force to be feared. Local elites sent their sons to Rome, sponsored public buildings, pledged loyalty to the emperor, yet retained a certain discrete autonomy. Still, this division was never static. As circumstances changed, the emperor could transfer a province from senatorial to imperial control, especially in cases of crisis or revolt. The reverse, however, was rare. Centralization of power increased over time. In the 3rd century after Christ, under the pressure of barbarian invasions, economic crises, and internal instability, many senatorial provinces were absorbed into imperial control. The simulation of duality began to crumble, and as the frontiers grew more unstable, the empire needed new administrative divisions. Diocletian and later Constantine introduced dioceses, tetrarchies, and new mechanisms of power distribution. But the original logic, established by Augustus, still haunted the imperial system like a ghost. Rome was multiple, and to govern so many worlds they had to be divided, though not always equally. Understanding who ruled and where is to understand how Rome kept such a vast machine running for centuries. But beyond the gears, there was a world of symbols and customs in collision, and to grasp how Rome dominated not only bodies, but also minds and hearts, it is time to dive into what truly shaped the provinces, the clash and coexistence between ancestral cultures and imposed Romanitas. Rome was not merely a military power, it was, above all, a great digester of civilizations. As the empire expanded, it encountered ancient peoples, consolidated social structures, complex religious systems, and cultures that had endured for centuries. The challenge was not just to conquer these lands by force, but to administer them without breaking the empire under the weight of its own diversity. Instead of erasing everything it encountered, Rome adopted a strategy of selective absorption, where domination was real, but cultural continuity was allowed, and sometimes even encouraged. It was a delicate balance between control and concession, force and diplomacy, imposition and adaptation. In Asia Minor, Rome inherited the remnants of the Persian Empire and the Hellenistic world. Cities like Ephesus, Pergamon, and Antioch were already cosmopolitan urban centers when the standards of the legions arrived. Instead of enforcing a rupture, Rome preserved many local administrative systems, adapting them to imperial logic. Greek art was admired, philosophers were respected, and Hellenized cities were granted the status of colonia or municipium. Greek remained the language of the East, and many emperors, such as Hadrian, encouraged a cultural fusion between Greek and Roman traditions. In this process, Rome did not destroy Hellenism, it domesticated it. The case of Egypt was even more unique. When Augustus defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in Ashur 31 before Christ, he didn't just conquer a territory, he inherited one of the most ancient and symbolic kingdoms in human history. Egypt was not just a place, it was a living myth, where the pharaoh was seen as a god, where the Nile dictated the rhythm of life, where the temples of Karnak and Luxor defied time. Rome, far from trying to erase this past, appropriated it with strategic reverence. Roman emperors came to be depicted as pharaohs in hieroglyphic inscriptions, maintained ancient cults in operation, and harnessed Egypt's symbolism as a source of sacred authority. Alexandria became a beacon of culture and science, a bridge between Eastern tradition and imperial rationality. In Galapa, however, the process was more turbulent. There, Rome encountered a tribal oral world led by warrior aristocracies and dominated by the influence of the Druids, spiritual and intellectual leaders held in high esteem by the Celtic peoples. The conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar, beginning in 58 before Christ, was brutal. Massacres, widespread enslavement, and the destruction of cities marked the campaign. But after conquest, Rome launched an accelerated cultural transformation. It founded colonies, built roads, introduced Latin, erected temples, and encouraged the Gallic elite to adopt Roman customs. The Druids were persecuted and eventually banned, for Rome tolerated no organized spiritual competition outside its control. Yet Celtic elements survived, merging with local traditions and forming a new hybrid identity, Romano-Gallic, that would persist into the Middle Ages. What unites these three examples, Hellenistic Asia, Pharaonic Egypt, and Celtic Gaul, is the way Rome, rather than leveling differences, instrumentalized them. It recognized the useful elements of each culture, its art, religion, symbols, and incorporated them into the imperial imagination. An emperor could be at once a Roman citizen, a Greek patron, an Egyptian pharaoh, and a slayer of druids. This malleability was not weakness, it was strategy. Rome knew that ruling such a vast world required more than swords. It required shared symbols, adapted mythologies, and an imperial narrative capable of convincing different peoples that under Roman rule there was a place for everyone, even if not an equal one. This process, however, was not uniform. In some regions, such as Roman Africa or Hispania, Romanization was swift and deep. In others, such as Judea or the Germanic territories, resistance was constant. Rome's ability to allow continuity where it was advantageous and to impose rupture where necessary is one of the reasons for its longevity. And it is also one of its greatest legacies. To this day, traces of that complex cultural fusion are found in the languages, laws, religions, and identities of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But to understand how such diversity remained cohesive in daily life, beyond decrees and battles, one must look at the concrete elements of Romanization, the roads that crossed deserts, the aqueducts that brought water to the provinces, the forums that centralized civic life, and the temples where Roman gods met local deities. Next, we will enter the physical architecture of the empire, the constructions that upheld its dominion over both bodies and minds. At the pulsing heart of the Roman Empire, no force was more enduring, not even the legions, than language, law, and faith. Physical conquest could be swift, carried out with swords and standards, but to conquer a people's customs, beliefs, and mental codes was a slower and deeper war. Across its vast provinces, Rome faced an unprecedented challenge, administering an empire made up of hundreds of peoples, dozens of languages, countless deities and legal traditions as old as the very cities it had conquered. And remarkably, it succeeded, not by erasing all differences, but by building a structure where diversity was tolerated, even celebrated, so long as it remained all subordinate to Roman order. Let us begin with language. Rome was officially Latin. Latin was the language of law, administration, courts, and military power, but in practice the empire was bilingual. In the East, the predominant language was Greek, inherited from the conquests of Alexander, kept alive by Hellenistic cities, and deeply rooted in the intellectual and commercial elites. Thus, in many eastern provinces, such as Syria, Asia Minor, and Egypt, official documents could be drafted in either Latin or Greek. This linguistic bifurcation was not seen as a threat, but as functionality. Latin represented legal and political authority. Greek embodied cultural refinement and intellectual tradition. In more peripheral areas, local languages persisted. Punic in Africa, Aramaic in Judea, Coptic in Egypt, Celtic in Gaul, Berber in the mountains. Rome did not forcibly impose Latin. It had encouraged it as the language of social mobility and visibility. To speak Latin was to become visible to the empire. This strategy of domination without destruction extended to the legal spherehouse as well. Roman law was one of the greatest creations of antiquity, but in the provinces, it was not applied uniformly from the start. In many cases, local laws were preserved, especially regarding civil and religious matters, as long as they did not conflict with imperial interests. Each city could have its own statutes, its own courts, and a degree of legal autonomy. But in serious matters, crimes against the empire, citizenship issues, or appeals against local rulings, the jus Romanum would intervene, the body of Roman laws that governed imperial society. The famous distinction between jus civil, law for Roman citizens, and jus gentium, law for non-citizens, allowed this legal coexistence, flexible on the surface, rigid at the core. Yet it was in the irreligious realm that Rome showed its greatest diplomatic finesse and its greatest vulnerability. The empire was shrouded in a mist of gods, rituals, cults, and sacrifices. Every conquered people brought their own pantheons, legends, and practices. Far from imposing a single religion, Rome practiced religious syncretism. It adopted foreign gods, associated them with its own, Zeus with Jupiter, Isis with Ceres, Baal with Saturn, and allowed local cults to persist, provided they did not threaten public order or imperial authority. Temples to Serapis flourished in Rome. Mithraic shrines appeared among the legions. The cult of Cybele gained prominence in festivals. The imperial religion was, above all, a patchwork quilt that cloaked the empire in the illusion of spiritual unity. However, there were limits. Certain religions, because of their exclusivity or rebellious nature, were viewed with suspicion or outright persecution. Judaism, with its refusal to worship other gods and armed resistance in provinces like Judea, faced harsh repression, culminating in the destruction of the Second Temple in Mesin 70 after Christ. Later, Christianity, born within Judaism and rapidly spreading among the empire's poor, slaves, and women, was also seen as a threat. Its insistence on one god, refusal to participate in public rituals, and critique of imperial authority caused discomfort in traditional structures. Sporadic persecutions and executions became more common, until, centuries later, the empire would convert to the very Christ it had once condemned. This tension between tolerance and control was the empire's hallmark. In the provinces, Rome walked a narrow path, allowing enough diversity to keep peace, but imposing enough cohesion to preserve authority. This dance between center and margins could be seen in temples, marketplaces, schools, and coins, where foreign gods shared space with the emperor's face. It was syncretism not as faith, but as a tool of power. By observing this linguistic, legal, and spiritual cauldron, we understand that the empire was less a state in the modern sense and more a pragmatic imperial platform, operating as a system of alliances, concessions, and constant surveillance. Romanization was not a fixed package. It was a continuous, porous, and at times contradictory process. And for this process to hold, it was necessary to literally build the pillars of empire. There were roads, aqueducts, forums, and markets that kept the machine in motion. This is what we will see next, how Rome used an infrastructure as an instrument of power, creating physical networks that sustained the empire far more effectively than any sword ever could. To govern an empire stretching from Britain to Syria, from the Danube to the Sahara, Rome needed more than armies and decrees. It needed physical connectivity. It had to transform distances into pathways, natural obstacles into strategic routes, and scattered cities into interconnected nodes of an imperial web. In this spirit, Rome built its true glory not only in marble, but in stone, lime, lead, concrete, and sweat. The roads, aqueducts, and forums were the arteries through which central Rome made its presence pulse in the provinces. These structures were not just feats of engineering, they were instruments of domination, of romanization, and of integration. Through them flowed not only legions and goods, but symbols, ideas, and the very image of the empire. Let us begin with the roads. The popular saying, "All roads lead to Rome," is not merely a metaphor. It is a testament to the most advanced road network of the ancient world. The Viae Romanae, built since the early days of the Republic, formed a radial system that connected the capital to the rest of the empire with near geometric precision. There were over 400,000 kilometers of roads, with at least 80,000 paved in stone, featuring solid foundations, side ditches for drainage, milestone markers, and rest areas. These roads allowed rapid movement of troops, transport of supplies, official communication between provinces, and the spread of administrative control. The tercursores, imperial messengers, could cover vast distances in just a few days, thanks to horse exchange stations set along major routes. An order from Rome could cross continents and arrive before a rebellion could gain momentum. The roads also played a symbolic role. On each milestone, the emperor's name was engraved. It was a way to inscribe his presence even in the farthest reaches of the empire. And the conquered peoples, by using those roads, not only made their lives easier, they were constantly reminded of who had transformed their land into Roman territory. But Rome didn't stop at forging paths. It brought water where there was none, and organized cities around public spaces of power. The aqueducts were another achievement that defied geography. From the hills of Rome to the plains of Africa, these structures carried water across tens of kilometers with precisely calculated gradients. In arid or mountainous provinces like Hispania and Asia Minor, aqueducts represented more than engineering. They represented civilization. Bringing water meant bringing hygiene, abundance, health, leisure. It enabled baths, fountains, public gardens, and sustained forums, public toilets, workshops, and homes. The people were grateful, but they were also subordinated, because the water came with the emperor's seal, and if the roads connected and the aqueducts supplied, it was the forums that organized civic life in the provinces. Every Roman city, especially colonies and municipia, had its forum, a rectangular space surrounded by columns, temples, basilicas, markets, and administrative buildings. There, power became visible and tangible. It was where business was conducted, disputes judged, rituals celebrated, the emperor's statue stood, and edicts from the capital were read aloud. The forum was the stage of political everyday life, the place where a provincial, crossing under its arches, understood that he no longer lived under his own kings or tribal chieftains. He now lived under Rome. Urban planning in the provinces followed standardized models. Streets intersected in a grid, with the Cardo and Decumanus as central axes. Designated areas existed for trade, housing, leisure, and worship. Amphitheaters, baths, circuses, and theaters were erected to entertain and integrate inhabitants into the Roman lifestyle. Leisure was part of the Imperial project. Bread was distributed, but the games, panem et circenses, provided catharsis, collective identity, and reinforcement of imperial power. Architecture was not neutral. It was propaganda carved in stone. Every column, every dome, every carefully placed slab served a larger purpose, to announce the presence of Rome where Rome had never been. And by building with such ambition, the empire also shaped the identity of those under its rule. Local elites, eager for prestige and social ascent, competed to sponsor public works, aqueducts, baths, temples, markets. It was an invisible exchange. Rome provided its technique and model, provincials offered their loyalty and resources. This architecture of control transformed the empire into a body that communicated with fluidity. Roads guaranteed movement, aqueducts, survival, forums belonging, even if subordinated. It was through this infrastructure that Rome maintained order, not just by the sword, but through the illusion of permanence and progress. And just like the buildings, the people were shaped too. The provincial was not merely governed, he was transformed. It is time to see him up close. In our next journey, we will explore how the common man lived in the provinces of the empire, his joys, fears, labors, and aspirations. Because to understand the empire is not only to follow its emperors, it is also to listen to the anonymous footsteps of millions of lives shaped by the stones of Rome. If emperors built palaces, senators drafted laws, and generals commanded legions, then who after all sustained the silent columns of the Roman Empire? The answer lies in the daily steps of the provincials, the ordinary men and women who lived far from the forum of Rome, yet carried the empire on their shoulders. They didn't decide the fate of kingdoms, but they tilled the land, worshipped their gods, raised their children, and supplied the cities. They were weavers in Hispania, fishermen in Numidia, stonemasons in Dacia, shepherds in Cappadocia, merchants in Gaul, doctors in Antioch, potters in Syria, and farmers in Thrace. The life of the Roman provincial was as diverse as the landscapes that surrounded them, and within it lay the true fabric of the empire. The daily existence of these men and women varied radically from one province to another, but certain structures united them, starting with their legal status. Over the centuries, Rome built a rigid social pyramid, with full Roman citizens at the top, initially only in Italy, but later extended to provincial elites, while the base consisted of peregrini, free foreigners without citizenship, and enslaved people, who made up a vast portion of the workforce. Even within citizenship there were layers: Latins, clients, allies, freedmen, each with specific rights and restrictions. The provincial, in most cases, was not a full citizen, at least not until the Edict of Caracalla in 212 after Christ, which extended Roman citizenship to all free men of the empire, leveling them legally, though not socially. In practice, a provincial's life was shaped by their city. Rome promoted urbanization in the provinces, and even rural villages began acquiring Roman structures: public baths, small forums, markets, temples. Living in a Roman city meant participating, in some form, in the Imperial project. There were spectacles in the amphitheater, emperor cults, taxes collected by local magistrates, and the imposition of urban rules, opening hours, hygiene regulations, laws against riots. The city was not merely a physical space, it was the stage where Roman identity was performed daily. In the countryside, however, life was closer to ancestral roots. Gallic farmers still used traditional tools. Syrian peasants followed harvest cycles around local shrines. Rome's presence was less visible, but still there, in the tax collectors, in military conscription, in coins bearing the emperor's face. The rural provincial might not read Latin, but recognized the symbols of power: the soldier, the censor, the magistrate, the scribe. In times of peace, Rome might be seen as a distant, even benevolent force. In times of crisis, as an oppressive presence that demanded but did not give. The religion of the provincial was another element of fusion and tension. Many kept their local gods even after temples to Jupiter, Mars, or Venus were built in their cities. In Britain, Celtic deities were associated with Roman gods. In Syria, the cult of Baal fused with Saturn. In Hispania, ancestral funerary practices persisted for centuries, even under Roman surveillance. This syncretism created a complex religious experience. The provincial might sacrifice to Juno in a Roman temple, and in secret chant old songs to the spirits of their ancestors. The economic life of the provincial oscillated between rural self-sufficiency and the commercial dynamism of the cities. In the countryside, families grew wheat, barley, grapes, and olives, raising sheep and pigs. In the cities, there was a bustling market of professions: potters, metalworkers, shoemakers, bakers, blacksmiths, teachers, doctors, and even astrologers. Interprovincial trade was active, with caravans and ships carrying goods across the empire. A Syrian merchant could sell cloth in Carthage, an Egyptian shipowner could transport grain to Rome. A doctor from Gaul might be summoned to treat an aristocrat in Ephesus. This network integrated provincials into an economic system that, while unequal, offered paths of advancement, especially for those who spoke Latin, served in the army, or maintained good ties with local patrons. Education varied. In more Romanized provinces, especially in the Greek East and Gaul, schools were established, and access to literacy grew, especially among the children of local elites. They studied Latin, Greek, rhetoric, philosophy, and mathematics. For the poorer classes, knowledge was passed orally: local myths, family stories, religious rituals. Education was a path to climb in Roman society, and many notable provincials, like the philosopher Seneca, born in Hispania, came from the empire's margins to become central voices. Family life followed regional customs, but the Roman model of patriarchy, with the father as supreme authority, was gradually adopted. Mixed marriages between Romans and provincials became common, especially between soldiers and local women. Over time, provincial families began adopting Latin names, dressing like Romans, decorating their homes with frescoes, mosaics, and classical statues. Romanization at this intimate level was a silent metamorphosis, a daily performance of belonging to an empire that was often only vaguely understood. The Roman provincial, then, was a hybrid being, neither fully Roman nor purely local. He lived at the crossroads of worlds, one foot in ancestral tradition, the other on Rome's paved roads. He was the invisible subject of official history, but the anonymous protagonist of imperial continuity. Without him, there would be no harvests, no legions, no taxes, no legacies. He was the one who upheld the order. He was the one who bore, day after day, the weight of Roman glory without ever being celebrated in marble columns. And between daily struggles and distant imperial commands, there was one constant presence: war rebellion. the ever-looming threat that required vigilance and military presence. In our next journey, we will discover the legions and the limes, the living frontier of the empire, and how the provinces became at once refuge and battlefield of eternal Rome. When contemplating the map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, the gaze is met with an overwhelming vastness: scorching deserts in Africa, dense forests in Germania, icy mountains in Dacia, mighty rivers like the Danube and the Rhine, and misty oceans bathing distant Britannia. To keep this empire united, efficient administration or robust infrastructure alone were not enough. Constant, disciplined, and strategically deployed military power was essential. It was within this context that the true supporting pillars of the empire emerged: the legions and the limes, the living frontier where the Roman world ended and the unknown began. The Roman legions were not merely armies, they were mobile communities, microcosms of imperial order, composed of trained soldiers, engineers, artisans, doctors, scribes, interpreters, and even musicians. Each legion was identified by a number and name: the Legio ex Gemina, the Legio II Augusta, the Legio Textix Valeria Victrix, and comprised around 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, all Roman citizens. They were stationed in imperial provinces, especially those on the frontiers, and their presence completely transformed the landscape. Wherever a legion settled, camps appeared, and these soon evolved into cities, such as Colonia Agrippina, Cologne, Vindobona, Vienna, and Lugdunum, Lyon. With them came order, security, and fear. Soldiers didn't just fight, they built. They were responsible for constructing the fortifications, bridges, roads, aqueducts, and fortresses. The Roman military camp, the castrum, followed a standardized layout, with walls, towers, gates, parade grounds, and administrative buildings. Soldiers slept, trained, worshipped gods, received wages and pensions, and many ended up settling in the region after completing their service. They married local women, even if technically forbidden during service, started families, and their children inherited a hybrid identity, part Roman, part provincial. The presence of legions in the provinces was not merely defensive. Often they were employed to suppress internal revolts, protect trade caravans, maintain urban order, and intimidate potential uprisings. Their mere presence, visible in standards, gleaming armor, and marching columns, served as a daily reminder of Roman authority, but they also generated tension. In regions such as Judea, the constant presence of troops was perceived as a provocation and contributed to the escalation of conflicts that led to full-scale wars against the empire. Along the far borders of the empire, the limes marked the boundary between the civilized Roman world and the so-called barbarian peoples. But the limes were not just walls. They were complex systems of defense, surveillance, and control, consisting of watchtowers, forts, ditches, palisades, patrol posts, and even military colonies. One of the most famous is Hadrian's Wall, built in northern Britannia by order of Emperor Hadrian around 122 after Christ, stretching about 117 kilometers. Further south along the Danube and Rhine rivers, fortresses such as Carnuntum and Mogontiacum served as strongholds against Germanic tribes. In North Africa, the limes Tripolitanus monitored nomadic incursions from the desert. These frontiers were more porous than absolute barriers. They allowed controlled flows of merchants, migrants, and soldiers, but could be sealed during times of threat. The empire organized its defense in layered zones. Behind the limes, in adjacent provinces, lay reserves of auxiliary troops, arsenals, food depots, retreat routes, and communication systems via smoke signals or mounted messengers. Generals in these areas had relative autonomy to act in case of invasion, and were often promoted for bravery or results, but they could also fall from grace quickly after failure, for a broken frontier was not just a physical breach, it was a symbolic fracture in Rome's invincibility. Over time, the frontiers became increasingly militarized. Germanic, Scythian, Parthian, Sarmatian, and other groups began pressing on the empire's edges. Security required constant vigilance, and provincials, especially those living near the borders, came to see military presence as an inseparable part of their landscape and routine. There was tension, yes, but also exchange. Soldiers bought from local markets, hired services, employed craftsmen, and built families. Many of these frontiers paradoxically became zones of cultural contact, where Rome and the other touched, fought, negotiated, and transformed one another. The Roman defensive system was effective, but not invulnerable. As external pressures mounted and internal crises eroded the empire's core, the legions became overburdened. Internal rebellions, disputes among generals, and short-lived emperors began to weaken the system. At times the frontiers collapsed, and with them entire provinces were lost. Yet for centuries the legions and the limes fulfilled their purpose, to protect the idea of Rome against the chaos beyond. Behind those walls, an apparent order prevailed, but the empire's true strength came from its most productive provinces, not just in grain, gold, or troops, but in geopolitical power. In the next chapter, we will explore the provinces that formed Rome's very backbone: Egypt, Syria, and Hispania, the silent vertices of the empire that fed, defended, and legitimized Roman domination. At the heart of the Roman colossus, 3 provinces did more than obey. They sustained it. Among so many conquered regions, a few stood out not merely for their geography or history, but for the strategic, economic, and symbolic centrality they assumed within the imperial machine. Egypt, Syria, and Hispania formed the 3 vertices of a silent yet decisive triangle upon which Rome rested part of its stability, its food supply, and even its imperial identity. Each of these provinces was, in itself, a world, yet all of them served, in their own unique intensity, the Roman project of eternity. Let us begin with Egypt, the mystical jewel of the empire, whose fertile lands along the Nile had sustained pharaohs for millennia before Augustus turned it into the personal property of the emperor. No other province held this status. After the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Romanization before Christ, Augustus took exclusive control over the land of the pharaohs. No Roman senator could even enter Egypt without authorization. There the governor, the praefectus Egyptumi, was always of the equestrian order, appointed directly by the emperor. Egypt was not just another province, it was Rome's granary, the source of the grain that fed the masses of the capital. A single failed harvest or disruption in Nile navigation could bring hunger and fury to the Roman people. But Egypt offered more than bread. It was a spiritual and cultural reservoir where deep religiosity thrived, ancient science flourished, and millennia-old temples still pulsed with life. Alexandria, with its legendary library and lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, was an unparalleled intellectual center, a crossroads of Greek thought, Roman administration, and Eastern wisdom. Egypt, therefore, was a mirror that Rome dared not shatter. Politically dominated, yet culturally revered, emperors visited it with near superstitious reverence. Egyptian gods like Isis and Serapis came to be worshipped even within Italian soil. To dominate Egypt was also to absorb its mysticism as reinforcement of imperial power. North of Egypt, Syria played a different but equally vital role. It was the far one great eastern bastion of the empire. Nestled between the Mediterranean Sea and the Arabian deserts, Syria bordered the powerful Parthian Empire and later the Sassanids, Rome's constant rivals. For that reason, it was a highly militarized province, with numerous legions stationed along its borders and fortresses spread around the Euphrates. But Syria was also a thriving economic center, home to cities like Antioch, Damascus, and Palmyra. Rich in trade, it produced textiles, perfumes, dried fruits, spices, and served as a bridge between East and West. Culturally, Syria was a melting pot, heir to Hellenism, yet deeply rooted in Semitic and Persian traditions. It nurtured a plural religiosity, with solar cults, temples to Jupiter Dolichinos, influential Jewish communities, and later, the first seeds of Christianity. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest Christian bishops came from Syria, and it was from there that the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, in the 3rd century, attempted to impose the worship of a Syrian solar deity upon the entire empire. Syria did not merely integrate, it influenced. It was not merely monitored, it was heard, feared, and courted. Then came Hispania. In the far west, a living testament that a province could be conquered and, over time, become Rome's mirror, and even its source. Initially a stage for long wars during the Republic, including the fierce resistance of tribes like the Celtiberians and the traumatic memory of Carthaginian occupation, Hispania was gradually pacified, colonized, and Romanized with remarkable success. The construction of cities like Emerita Augusta, Tarraco, and Cordoba transformed the Iberian landscape into a Roman urban archipelago. Roads, aqueducts, bridges, and theaters quickly emerged. Latin replaced local languages. Local politics mimicked Rome's, and Hispania's elites became fully integrated into the Senate and imperial order. But Hispania's greatest prestige came with the birth of two of the most important emperors in Roman history, Trajan and Hadrian, both born in Hispania. Trajan, famed for his military conquests and for expanding the empire to its greatest extent, was widely seen as an ideal emperor, and his rise showed that Rome was no longer just a place, but a universal idea, accessible even to the sons of the provinces. Hadrian, his successor, was even more symbolic. Enamored with the East, a promoter of religious syncretism, architect and tireless traveler, he embodied the intimate union between the empire's margins and its center. These three provinces, Egypt, Syria, and Hispania, sustained Rome in every way, in its stomach, its sword, its thought, and even its soul. They fed the capital, defended its most sensitive borders, and produced emperors who shaped the empire's destiny. They were at once provinces and pillars, and without them Rome would not have been Rome. But not all provinces accepted this role quietly. Some resisted, some burned, and few burned like Judea, whose explosive relationship with Rome gave rise to revolts, destruction, and a historical wound that would span centuries. In the next immersion, we will descend into the embers of Jerusalem and its surroundings to understand how a small people with unshakable faith dared to challenge the world's greatest empire and paid the price in blood and memory. Among all the provinces of the Roman Empire, few stirred as much unrest, fear, and perplexity as Judea, a small territory, dry and rugged in geography, yet spiritually immense. In Judea, Rome did not merely face rebels, it faced a faith, a people deeply rooted in their religion, in their covenant with a single jealous God who refused to bow to idols, statues, or foreign rituals, a people who did not see Caesar as a deity, but as an intruder. And in an empire that was sustained as much by the sword as by the symbolic acceptance of imperial order, Judea was a perpetual spark in a barrel of spiritual gunpowder. Rome's relationship with Judea began back in the Republic, with military support granted to the heirs of the Maccabean dynasty and increasing influence over the Hasmonean kings. After the death of Herod the Great, in Rasi Barfopan before Christ, the region entered a phase of instability marked by internal strife, popular resentment, and growing dissatisfaction with Roman rule. In Anno 6 after Christ, Judea officially became an imperial province, governed by a Roman procurator. It was in this atmosphere of tension and discontent that messianic figures, apocalyptic hopes, and resistance movements emerged. The Jewish people lived a painful contradiction. On one hand, the city of Jerusalem was a metropolis with a strong Roman presence, infrastructure, commerce, and ties to the Mediterranean world. On the other, it was the center of the most unyielding monotheistic cult of antiquity, built around a majestic temple that was, more than a building, the dwelling place of God on earth. For the Jews, there was one law, the Torah, and one sovereign, Yahweh. This tension exploded each time Rome tried to insert imperial symbols into Judea's spiritual landscape. The cult of the emperor, tolerated as mere formality in other provinces, was seen here as blasphemy. The First Great Revolt erupted in Phi, 66 after Christ, led by zealot groups who incited the people to rise up. The Roman governor was expelled, legions were defeated, and for a brief moment Judea appeared to regain freedom. But Rome answered with the wrath of titans. General Vespasian, and later his son Titus Maidos, led a methodical campaign of suppression. Entire cities were devastated. Hundreds of thousands died. And in 70 after Christ, Jerusalem was besieged, captured, and the Pharaoh's second temple was destroyed. Its walls collapsed, its priests were killed, its altar desecrated. What had been the heart of Judaism was turned to ruins. Only one wall remained, and it would become for future centuries the Kate, Wailing Wall. But the flame of resistance did not die out. In 132 after Christ, under Emperor Hadrian, a new uprising broke out, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Led by a man proclaimed the Messiah, the rebellion succeeded in establishing an autonomous government for a few years. Coins were minted, Jewish laws reinstated, hope was reborn. But Rome returned with even greater force. The uprising was crushed, hundreds of thousands died, survivors were sold into slavery. Jerusalem was wiped from the map, rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, filled with temples to Jupiter, and Jews were banned from entering. Judea was renamed Palestine, a deliberate attempt to erase its historical identity. The temple's destruction and the dispersion of the Jewish people marked one of the first great diasporas in history, and paradoxically, this forced exile became the seed of an even more resilient faith. Without the temple, the Jews reinvented their religion as a portable tradition, centered on the synagogue, on scripture, memory, and messianic hope. Rome thought it had won, but Judaism survived, partly as resistance, partly as historical persistence. And from this land marked by blood and belief, Christianity would also emerge, a new branch of Jewish tradition, initially dismissed by Rome, later persecuted, and eventually destined to transform the empire itself. The relationship between Rome and Judea is a mirror of the limitations of imperial power. It shows that military and administrative dominance could subjugate peoples, destroy cities, ban rituals, but could not eliminate a deeply held belief. By destroying the temple, Rome sought to erase a people, but instead, it carved its name into a history that was not its own. Jerusalem burned, but its flame ignited centuries of spirituality, philosophy, and resistance. And while the embers of Judea still smoldered, other provinces offered the opposite example, places where romanization was more peaceful, more profound, more enduring. One of them, perhaps the most emblematic, was Gaul. Once a fierce enemy, it became a model of integration, even producing emperors and philosophers. In our next journey, we'll explore the path of Gaul from Vercingetorix to the Gallic Empire, and how it transformed from adversary to mirror of Rome. Gaul, now part of present-day France, Belgium, Switzerland, and northern Italy, was for centuries a land of mystery, fear, and desire in the eyes of the Romans. Seen as the beyond the Alps, inhabited by fierce tribes, tall warriors with golden hair, druids cloaked in silence, and sacred forests where the gods bore strange names, Gaul appeared to be everything Rome was not: untamed, undisciplined, ancient. Yet this territory, which began as a mortal enemy of the Republic, would come to be one of the most Romanized, prosperous, and influential pillars of the empire. The story of Gaul, from the rebellion of Vercingetorix to the brief Gallic Empire and its reintegration by Aurelian, is the story of how Rome not only conquered but transformed, and was transformed in return. In the 1st century before Christ, Gaul was still a mosaic of Celtic peoples, such as the Arverni, the Aedui, the Belgae, and the Treveri. They lived in tribal structures, with agrarian economies and a deeply spiritual culture. Their druids were priests, judges, and keepers of oral memory, wielding enormous power over the people, all without ever writing anything down. It was in this setting that the young and ambitious Julius Caesar, proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, launched one of the most brutal and brilliant campaigns in Roman history, the Gallic Wars, which lasted from 58 to 50 before Christ. He not only defeated the tribes one by one, but documented everything in his famous Commentaries on the Gallic War, crafting the narrative of a civilizing hero confronting barbarism. The climax of this conflict was the figure of Vercingetorix, prince of the Arverni, who succeeded in uniting several Gallic tribes against Rome. His scorched earth tactics, strategic retreats, and organized resistance nearly turned the tide. But Caesar, with calculated brutality, besieged the fortified city of Alesia in 52 before Christ, defeating the allied army. Vercingetorix personally surrendered unarmed before Caesar, and would later be paraded in Rome during the victor's triumph before being executed. With that symbolic and political defeat, Gaul was incorporated as a Roman province, though the process of Romanization would still take generations. In the centuries that followed, Rome implemented in Gaul its full model of imperial integration. It founded colonies, urbanized entire regions, built roads like the Via Agrippa, erected amphitheaters, aqueducts and forums. Cities such as Lugdunum, Lyon, Treverorum, Trier, Nemausus, Nimes, and Arelate, Arles, became urban showcases of Roman identity, filled with the most sophisticated elements of architecture, baths, schools and temples. Latin gradually replaced Celtic languages among the elites. Druids were progressively banned, especially under Claudius, himself born in Gaul, and Roman gods began to share space with local deities reinterpreted in Latin forms. The most fascinating transformation was that, within a few generations, Gallic elites became indistinguishable from their Italian counterparts. They entered the Senate, participated in imperial administration, intermarried with Romans, and even produced emperors. The most famous example is the Antonine dynasty, to which Antoninus Pius, born in Nimes, and Marcus Aurelius, with roots in the region, belonged. Gaul had ceased to be a frontier and had become a heartland. It was a rich, urbanized, integrated province and deeply loyal. But that loyalty would be put to the test in the 3rd century after Christ, as the empire began to crumble under the weight of economic crises, barbarian invasions, and civil wars. In 260, after Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persians, Roman authority collapsed in several regions. Taking advantage of the power vacuum, General Postumus, commander of the troops in Gaul, proclaimed himself emperor and founded the so-called Gallic Empire, which lasted about 14 years, with its capital in Trier. This political entity controlled not only Gaul, but also Hispania and Britannia, functioning as a parallel Rome. It had its own coinage, government, and the support of local elites. What is most surprising is not its creation, but its level of organization. This alternative empire was not a barbarian rebellion. It was a project to preserve Roman order in the absence of Rome itself, a desperate attempt to maintain peace, prosperity, and Roman identity in the face of imperial collapse. It only came to an end in 274, when Aurelian reconquered the region and reintegrated it into the empire, ending the episode with clemency and political wisdom. Over the centuries, Gaul traced a complete arc, from enemy to model, from battlefield to source of emperors, from tribal resistance to sophisticated laboratory of Romanization. When Rome eventually fell centuries later, it was in former provinces like Gaul that its cultural, legal, and linguistic forms survived. And it is no coincidence that the Latin spoken in Gaul would give rise to French, that Gallic administrative customs would help shape feudalism, and that the Roman memory in Gaul would inspire Charlemagne, 1,000 years later, to attempt the creation of a new empire. But if Gaul was successfully integrated, other provinces played their roles in quieter yet vital ways, feeding the empire. Next, we will explore Roman Africa, the granary of the Mediterranean, supplier of grain, lions, and political power, and understand how the red earth of Africa sustained the white marble city that was Rome. To Roman eyes, Africa was not merely a distant and exotic continent. It was a promise of fertility, wealth, and power. If the legions conquered the world with iron, Rome survived on wheat. And a vast portion of that wheat, along with olive oil, wine, marble, wild animals, and even intellectuals, came from Roman Africa. Contrary to modern images that associate the continent with aridity and poverty, Africa in antiquity was seen as a fertile west, an economic and spiritual heart of the empire. And by understanding the role of its African provinces, especially proconsular Africa and Numidia, we come to see how a land once hostile to Rome became one of its firmest foundations. The conquest of Africa began with the Punic Wars, particularly the defeat of Carthage in 146 before Christ. Completely destroyed, its memory was erased with salt and fire, but its incredibly rich soil could not be ignored. Over its ashes, Rome founded a new city, Colonia Julia Carthago, Roman Carthage, which would become the second largest city in the Western Empire, surpassed only by the capital itself. From that point on, proconsular Africa, corresponding to modern Tunisia and parts of Libya, became one of the most prized provinces of the Republic and later of the Empire. What made Roman Africa an imperial treasure was, above all, its land. The North African region, with its Mediterranean climate, volcanic soils, and refined agricultural techniques, inherited from the Carthaginians and Berbers, allowed for abundant harvests of wheat, barley, olives, grapes, and dates. Vast estates were owned by Roman aristocrats or Romanized local elites, many of whom produced agricultural surpluses on a massive scale. African grain was transported in bulk cargo ships across the Mediterranean to Rome and other cities, supplying the public granaries, the horiastes, and supporting the famous annona, the free distribution of food to citizens of the capital. But Africa provided more than just bread. It was also a source of gold, precious stones, horses, valuable timber, and exotic animals such as lions, leopards, hippos, and elephants. These animals were captured by local hunters and sold to merchants who transported them to the Colosseum, where they took part in the bloody spectacles that defined Roman entertainment. Africa, quite literally, fed Rome with flesh, in every sense of the word. Administratively, Africa was stable and traditional. Considered a pacified province, it was governed by a senatorial proconsul, with no need for significant military presence, though auxiliary troops were stationed in the southern regions and along the frontier with desert nomads. In areas such as Numidia, Berber tribes coexisted with Roman cities, and their relationship was managed through diplomacy, tributes, and, at times, repression. The African frontier was marked by the Limes Tripolitanus, a network of fortifications and watchtowers in the Libyan desert that protected agricultural colonies from raids and invasions. Roman Africa was also deeply urbanized and Romanized. Cities like Leptis Magna, Timgad, Duga, Sabratha, and Thuga were architectural jewels, with theaters, triumphal arches, forums, baths, and markets. African art and architecture blended Roman forms with local influences, creating a unique style. And the region also gave rise to remarkable intellectuals. The most famous was Augustine of Hippo, Christian philosopher and theologian born in Tagaste, whose writings would shape Western thought for millennia. Religiously, Roman Africa was diverse. Traditional Roman cults coexisted with local deities like the African Saturn and imported cults such as those of Isis, Mithras, and Cybele. Yet it was in Africa that Christianity flourished with particular strength. By the 3rd century after Christ, Africa had become one of the major centers of Latin Christianity, with dozens of bishoprics and vibrant communities. It was also the stage for schisms and persecutions, such as the Donatist movement, and the repressions carried out by both pagan and later imperial Christian authorities against local heresies. With all this, Africa was not a periphery. It was a functional core. It sustained Rome materially, spiritually, and intellectually. Its citizens spoke Latin, its cities produced senators, and its fields fed the people who cheered gladiators and emperors. The fall of Africa into the hands of the Vandals in the 5th century was one of the deepest blows dealt to the Western Empire. Rome would not fall only by the sword, but also by hunger when its granary was lost. And while North Africa stood for prosperity and loyalty, other provinces, farther away and shrouded in mist, symbolized the ongoing challenge of conquest and imperial control. In our next journey, we will cross the English Channel and enter Roman Britannia, where the Romans faced unknown forests, resistant tribes, and a relentless climate, to leave their mark on the farthest edges of the known world. At the farthest edge of the world known to the Romans, where the sun set over misty fields and damp forests, lay Britannia, a land of eternal fog, stormy seas, and untamed tribes. To the ancients, it was more than a province. It was an enigma, a near-mythical frontier. The Greeks had heard of it as Albion, the island of white cliffs. Julius Caesar had attempted to invade it in 2 ambitious yet inconclusive expeditions in 55 and 54 before Christ. It was only a century later that Rome resolved to turn that remote, fragmented and mysterious island into part of its empire. And that decision would mark one of the most fascinating episodes of Roman expansion, the conquest of the Mists. The definitive invasion of Britannia occurred under Emperor Claudius in 43 after Christ, led militarily by General Aulus Plautius. The legions crossed the English Channel and landed in a land that felt both familiar and strange. Warlike Celtic tribes, the Catuvelauni, Iceni, Brigantes, and Silures, dominated the territory. They spoke archaic languages, practiced druidic rites, and worshipped gods rooted in the forces of nature: rivers, stones, forests. The Romans, masters of armed diplomacy, forged alliances with rival tribes to weaken the strongest centers of resistance. The city of Camulodunum was captured and transformed into the first Roman capital of the island, later followed by Londinium, founded as a trade outpost on the banks of the Thames. But resistance soon erupted. One of the most iconic figures of this struggle was Boudica, queen of the Iceni. After the death of her husband, a Roman client king, her lands were annexed by force, her daughters raped, and she herself publicly humiliated. In 60, after Christ, she led a massive revolt. She burned Camulodunum, destroyed Londinium, and massacred Roman soldiers and civilians. Rome had to mobilize every available force to quell the rebellion. When Boudica was finally defeated, her name was erased from official records, but never from history. She would become an eternal symbol of resistance against the empire. From the consolidated control in the island's southeast, Rome pushed further north and west. But the peoples of Caledonia, corresponding to modern Scotland, were never fully subdued. They were fierce fighters, mountain tribes that struck and vanished into mists and bogs. To contain them, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of one of the most impressive feats of military engineering in the ancient world: Hadrian's Wall, stretching 117 kilometers between the Tyne and Solway rivers. It was more than a physical barrier. It was an ideological frontier, where empire ended and mystery began. Later, Emperor Antoninus Pius attempted to push this frontier even farther north, building the lesser-known Antonine Wall. But the conquest was fleeting. The Caledonian tribes were like the wind, but impossible to capture. Over time, Britannia settled into the role of a tense border province, yet Romanized, with prosperous urban centers such as Verulamium, Eboracum, modern York, and Lindum, Lincoln. Roads, baths, agricultural villas, and temples were built. The local elite began adopting the language, customs, and even gods of Rome. Cultural fusion became visible in the arts, bilingual tombstones, and mosaics blending Celtic themes with classical forms. Yet no matter how integrated Britannia became, it was never entirely tamed. Pockets of resistance remained, along with unsubdued tribes and threats from beyond the walls. In the 3rd century, during the empire's crisis, Britannia was briefly part of the Gallic Empire under Postumus. Later, in the 4th century, it became a stage for power struggles between usurpers, legions loyal to different emperors, and sporadic invasions by Picts and Scots. When, in 410 after Christ, Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the Britons instructing them to defend themselves, the Roman presence on the island came to an official end. But Rome did not leave Britannia as it had found it. It left cities, roads, laws, advanced agriculture, a trade network, and a new Romanized elite. More than that, it left behind a civilizational nostalgia. In the centuries that followed, the British peoples would look back with longing and reverence for the order the legions had brought. And in the European imagination, that distant land shrouded in mist would continue to nourish legends, including that of King Arthur, often linked to the lost Roman heritage seeking to restore a former glory. Britannia was Rome's last true conquest, and one of the first to be lost. A cycle that perfectly illustrates the fate of the empire: to conquer, to build, to resist, to dissolve. Yet as the empire expanded to the edge of the world, the heart of power kept close watch over another land of incomparable value: Egypt, not merely as a province, but as the emperor's personal domain. It is a subject we have explored before, but one that deserves deeper examination in its political and symbolic uniqueness. Among all the provinces of the vast Roman Empire, only one answered neither to the Senate nor to an ordinary legate. It was reserved, untouchable, sacred, and strategic: Egypt. Land of the Nile, the pharaohs, the pyramids, and gods with human bodies and animal heads, was no ordinary province. It was the personal property of the emperor, a piece of the world that no Roman senator could set foot in without express authorization. And this exception, far from being a mere administrative quirk, reveals one of the deepest secrets of Rome's art of governance. Real power lies not only in force, but in control over the sources of sustenance and meaning. After the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, at the Battle of Actium in 31. Before Christ and the subsequent annexation of Egypt, the newly proclaimed Augustus understood that this land required special treatment. Instead of integrating Egypt as another senatorial or imperial province, he transformed it into a separate entity, beyond the reach of aristocratic ambition. Its administration was entrusted to a praefectus Egypti, a prefect of the equestrian order, and therefore outside the Senate, who reported directly to the emperor. It was a way to ensure that no one but the princeps himself had access to the empire's great economic trump card, Egyptian grain. Egypt was the empire's granary. The Nile's floods ensured abundant and predictable harvests. Farmlands stretched for kilometers, and the agricultural surplus was carried by barges to Alexandria, then by ship to Italian ports. It's estimated that Egypt directly fed about 1/3 of Rome's population. The logistical system was extraordinary. Coordinated by imperial officials, it involved ports, granaries, contracts with transporters, and constant oversight. Rome could conquer the world, but without Egyptian bread, its own people would collapse. A shortage of grain could spark riots, and for the emperor, controlling Egypt was a matter of political survival. But that ancient land held more than just grain. Egypt was a factory of symbols. Its millennia-old temples, mysterious hieroglyphs, theocratic tradition, and cosmopolitan cities formed a backdrop that still fascinates us today. When the Romans occupied Egypt, they did not destroy its religiosity. They absorbed it with strategic reverence. Emperors like Augustus, Tiberius, Hadrian, and even Caracalla were depicted in Egyptian temples as legitimate pharaohs. Traditional iconography was preserved, rituals continued, and priests maintained part of their authority. It was as if Rome declared, "We rule Egypt, but we honor its gods, for now they serve us." This political and religious fusion found one of its centers in Alexandria, a city founded by Alexander the Great and transformed by the Romans into one of the empire's most important metropolises. With its colossal lighthouse, its museum and library, and a diverse population of Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and Romans, Alexandria was a miniature of the Eastern Roman world. Philosophy, medicine, and mathematics flourished there. It was also a cauldron of religious tension, where Jews and pagans often clashed, and where Christianity began to develop strongly in the 3rd century. Politically, Egypt was governed with a firm hand. The imperial prefect held civil, military, and even judicial power. No other province granted a single man so much authority, and for this reason, the Egyptian prefect was chosen with extreme care. His loyalty to the emperor had to be absolute. Egypt could not fall into the hands of the ambitious. For any insurrection that could jeopardize Rome's food supply. Ships departing from Alexandria were escorted all the way to Ostia, and delays were cause for investigation in the Senate. Bread and the throne were intertwined. Over time, Egypt also became one of the first provinces to embrace Christianity, especially in Alexandria. Great Christian thinkers such as Origen and Clement of Alexandria emerged there, and its catechetical school would shape the theological foundations of the future church. In the 4th century, with the empire's conversion to Christianity, Egypt saw its temples gradually closed, its gods relegated to history and its ancient deities silenced. Yet its importance never faded. Even in the decline of the Western Empire, Egypt remained the economic backbone of the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which made Alexandria one of its wealthiest capitals. And when, in the 7th century, the Arabs conquered Egypt, they inherited not just a land, but an agricultural, administrative, and symbolic structure deeply shaped by Rome. Egypt was the hidden lung of the empire, silent, productive, powerful, and like all vital structures, rarely visible in statues of emperors or pages of military glory. But without it, Rome would never have endured as it did. In our next journey, we'll follow this same logic of silent power, exploring how Rome monitored and controlled its provincial officials through censors, inspectors, spies, and messengers, an invisible web that kept the empire united, even at the most distant edges of the map. When Rome became an empire, it was not content with merely conquering lands. It wanted to watch every border, every village, every plaza, every breath of its governors. And to achieve that, it built not only roads and legions, it built an invisible network of control, as effective and subtle as its walls were solid. It was a web of power that stretched across the empire like veins through which not blood, but orders, taxes, secrets, and obedience flowed. In this system, inspectors, censors, procurators, and spies were not just officials. They were the eyes and ears of Rome, the presence of the emperor where the emperor could not be. Each Roman province had a supreme authority at its head, a governor with civil, judicial, and often military powers. In senatorial provinces, they were proconsuls. In imperial ones, legates or prefects. But this man did not govern alone. Beneath him, and often above him without his knowing, operated complex layers of parallel administration. The emperor, distrustful by nature, after all many of his predecessors had been betrayed by subordinates, maintained a system of constant and far-reaching oversight, turning the empire into not just a monarchy, but a machine of surveillance. The censors, originally magistrates of the Republic, had as their main function the registration of the population, the supervision of public morals, and the upkeep of the tax census. Although their role changed over time, the practice of censoria, periodic evaluation of territories and citizens, continued in the provinces, allowing the empire to know its own mass, how many people there were, where they lived, what they owned, how much they produced, and how much they owed. These records were essential for tax collection and military conscription. More importantly, they were a statistical mirror of the empire, constantly updated. Tax officials and procurators were the executors of the economic system. They handled taxes, oversaw public contracts, monitored ports, mines, granaries, and warehouses. In practice, they were the financial administrators of the provinces. Many belonged to the equestrian order, an elite administrative class below the senators, and reported directly to the emperor. Their reports, sent by fast routes to Rome, allowed the palace to know precisely how much gold came out of Dacia, how much grain was shipped from Egypt, how much wine was produced in Gaul, how much marble was extracted from Asia Minor. Nothing escaped the gaze of the imperial treasury. But the most subtle, and perhaps most feared aspect of Roman control, was the presence of secret agents and official spies, known as speculatores, and, later, agentes in rebus. These men were dispatched to the provinces under various disguises: messengers, diplomats, administrative aides, supervisors. In truth, they were there to observe governors, listen to rumors, assess troop morale, detect conspiracies, and report everything directly to the emperor. Their word could mean promotion or execution. They were the silent instruments of imperial politics. No governor, no matter how powerful, was beyond reach. This web of control extended also to edicts and official messages, carried by the cursus publicus, the empire's postal network. Horses, ships, and rest stations allowed a decree from Rome to reach the frontiers of Britannia or Syria in a matter of days. The postal system was also used to transport reports, tax rolls, names of rebels, and formal accusations. It was the voice of the empire whispering in the ears of its agents, even thousands of kilometers away. It is important to note this control was not only punitive, it was also preventive and meritocratic. Effective governors and procurators could be promoted, honored, transferred to more prestigious posts, but they could also be removed without notice, tried, fined, or exiled. The logic was clear. To serve Rome well was to serve the emperor well. To serve oneself from the province was treason. There was another instrument of pressure: public memory. Poor administrations were recorded in the annals, denounced in local senates, remembered on the tombstones of victims. And good ones were celebrated with statues, triumphal arches, street names, and coins minted with praises. The province was a stage, and the governor the protagonist under the watchful eyes of thousands of extras who knew exactly what was expected of a good Roman. For all these reasons, the administrative machinery of the empire was simultaneously rigid and flexible. It could tolerate a diversity of languages, customs, and religions, but not betrayal, tax evasion, or disrespect for hierarchy. It was a constant balance between centralization and autonomy, trust and vigilance, prestige and fear. And it is precisely this logic that explains one of the most surprising phenomena in imperial history. When the provinces stopped being merely governed by Rome and began producing emperors themselves, That is what we will explore in the next journey. How Caracalla's decree of universal citizenship opened the way for men born far from Italy to become Caesars and transform the empire from within. For centuries, being a Roman citizen was a privilege, an invisible seal of belonging to a legal, political, and cultural elite that distinguished the center from the margins, the ruler from the ruled, the us from the them. Citizenship was more than status. It was identity, legal protection, exemption from certain taxes, and above all, dignity in the Roman world. But in the year 212 after Christ, something changed, abruptly and seemingly generously. Emperor Caracalla, through the Constitutio Antoniniana, decreed that all free men within the empire were now Roman citizens. In an instant, the legal borders between center and periphery were abolished. But why? And what did this really mean? Caracalla, born Lucius Septimius Bassianus, was the son of Emperor Septimius Severus, who came from Africa, and his mother was of Syrian origin. Caracalla himself already represented a new reality. The empire was ruled by someone who had not been born in Italy, nor belonged to the old Roman senatorial aristocracy. His decision to universalize citizenship was not just an idealistic gesture, it was a political, economic, and symbolic maneuver, marking the peak of a process that had been unfolding for centuries, the expansion of Roman identity beyond the walls of the urbs. Politically, the edict strengthened the bond between emperor and subjects. Instead of citizens and non-citizens, there were now only Romans and slaves. The emperor ceased to be merely the leader of an aristocracy and became, at least in theory, the sovereign of all. This move diminished the power of the senatorial class and increased popular support for the throne, especially among provincial elites, who now gained access to offices and honors previously reserved for a few. It also allowed for a deeper symbolic integration of the provinces into the empire. A Syrian, an Egyptian, a Dacian, or a Briton could now, at least on paper, claim to be Roman with the same right as a native of Campania. Economically, the edict had an even more direct goal: to increase tax revenue. Certain taxes and fees, such as those on inheritance and the manumission of slaves, were levied only on citizens. By granting universal citizenship, Caracalla expanded the tax base. At the time, the empire was facing financial crises, costly military campaigns, and growing pressure to maintain its borders. The measure, therefore, was as much fiscal as it was rhetorical. Yet despite the grandeur of the declaration, universal citizenship did not erase real inequalities. In practice, the differences between provincial inhabitants and the citizens of the capital remained, in wealth, in access to power, in political influence. It was as though Rome had extended the title of citizen to all, but kept the concrete privileges for a select few. Still, the gesture had deep consequences. It leveled the symbolic playing field and opened the way for men from distant regions to rise to the highest offices in the empire. From the 3rd century onward, we see a series of emperors of provincial origin: Maximinus Thrax, the first peasant to become emperor; Aurelian from Pannonia; Diocletian from Dalmatia; Galerius from Serbia; and later Constantine, born in Moesia on the banks of the Danube. Rome was no longer the physical center of power. It had become an idea, one that could be carried and embodied by anyone with ambition, charisma, and military support. The empire was now translocal. This was reflected in governance itself. Emperors began to rule from other cities: Trier, Sirmium, Nicomedia, Antioch, Mediolanum, Milan, no longer exclusively from Rome. This shift of power did not necessarily signal decline, but rather adaptation to the reality of a multicultural, polycentric empire. Roman identity was no longer defined by blood or birth, but by culture, language, and above all, loyalty to the emperor. An African could command legions, a Syrian could write philosophical treatises, a Briton could be promoted in the army. Citizenship, once a closed club, had become a symbolic space shared by tens of millions of people, something unprecedented in history. However, this expansion also brought challenges. Roman identity began to blur. Cultural distinctions resurfaced in other forms: religious, linguistic, regional. And with the 3rd century crisis, local loyalties began to compete with imperial loyalty. For many, being a citizen no longer meant feeling Roman. It was a legal title, but not necessarily an emotional one. And into this symbolic void emerged new forms of belonging, like Christianity, military allegiance, and regional identities that would pave the way for the end of the empire and the birth of medieval Europe. Thus, the Constitutio Antoniniana was both a culmination and a turning point. It was the moment when Rome reached all its subjects and at the same time began to lose itself among them. And it is precisely in this new landscape that we will see men who were born neither in Italy nor into power, but who became emperors, changing the course of Roman history forever. In the next journey, we'll explore the emblematic cases of Guy, Trajan, Hadrian, Septimius Severus, and other provincial emperors who transformed the periphery into the new center of the world. For centuries, Rome considered itself the center of the world, not only geographically but symbolically. To be Roman was to be born on the Italian peninsula, heir to the founders of the Urbs, shaped by the hills of Latium and the virtues of the ancients. The first emperors all came from there: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, names carved into the stone of tradition. But the empire they created soon became too vast, too diverse, too deep to fit solely within Rome. And gradually, from the margins of that world emerged new men, forged in the provinces, who not only served the empire, they came to rule it. The first and perhaps most symbolic was Trajan, emperor from 98 to 117, after Christ, born in the city of Italica, in the province of Hispania Baetica, present-day Spain. Son of a prominent general, Trajan was the first emperor born outside of Italy, and his reign marked the height of Rome's territorial expansion. He conquered Dacia, annexed Arabia, challenged the Parthians, and led the Roman legions to the Persian Gulf. But more than a conqueror, he was an exemplary administrator, respected by the Senate, beloved by the people, and praised by posterity. The Senate, in referring to future emperors, would say they should be felicis sicut Augustus, meliores quam Trajanus, as fortunate as Augustus, better than Trajan. His successor, Hadrian, also born in Italica, was a ruler of a different character, less expansive, more contemplative, a tireless traveler. He spent more time outside Rome than within it. He toured the provinces, strengthened frontiers, promoted art and philosophy. He ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall at the edge of Britannia and transformed Athens into a cultural beacon of the empire. Passionate about Greek culture, religious syncretism, and monumental architecture, Hadrian embodied the essence of the provincial world, an emperor who spoke many languages and understood many gods. Under him, Rome ceased to be the exclusive center of civilization and became a network of interlinked cultures united by law, roads, and currency. Another turning point came with Septimius Severus, emperor from 193 to 211, born in Leptis Magna, in proconsular Africa. Of Berber and Punic ancestry, Severus broke with the Italian aristocratic tradition and consolidated imperial power in provincial hands. His government was militarized, authoritarian, and centralized. He reformed the armed forces, strengthened the soldiers' power, and reduced the Senate's role. He was the first emperor to open the gates of imperial administration to a fully non-Italian elite, granting positions and authority to Africans, Syrians, Pannonians, and Thracians. Under his rule, Rome began to resemble the empire it governed, diverse, unequal, yet functional. The rise of these figures had wide-reaching consequences. Politically, it fractured the old Roman aristocracy and created a new imperial nobility, forged in the provinces, whose values were military merit, loyalty to the emperor, and administrative efficiency. Culturally, it dissolved the myth that only Italy could produce capable leaders. Religiously, it made room for a multitude of cults, Sol Invictus, Mithras, Isis, Serapis, reflecting the spiritual reality of a polycentric empire. Socially, it offered provincials a new horizon, not only to be Roman, but to be Rome. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, this process accelerated. Emperors like Maximinus Thrax, a peasant from Thrace, Diocletian, a soldier from Dalmatia, Galerius from Serbia, Aurelian, from Pannonia and Probus, from Syria, came from humble origins far from the capital. They were soldiers, sons of the land, products of the imperial military system. They rose to the throne amidst crises, invasions, famines, and revolts. They ruled with iron fists, reformed administrative structures, and reinvented the imperial model. And in doing so, they buried forever the idea that Rome was a place. Now Rome was a mobile project, flexible, breathing through the provinces that sustained its complex multicultural machinery. But this empire of others, though powerful, also faced growing internal tensions. The multiplication of emperors, the militarization of power, and the mistrust between center and margins set the stage for rupture. The army itself, once the defender of order, began to produce usurpers, palace assassinations, and frequent civil wars. The empire no longer rested on a single throne, but on multiple and fragile centers of power, held together more by habit than by conviction. And in this context, the provinces would cease to be pillars and become fuses. Regions that once provided loyal leaders now produced parallel empires, separatist movements, and networks of resistance. In our next journey, we will explore what happens when the provinces begin to break apart and the empire slowly begins to fall. For centuries, the provinces were the invisible foundation of the Roman Empire. They fed the capital, supplied soldiers, housed legions, and generated wealth, culture, and stability. But this vast and interdependent edifice began to show cracks, not all at once, nor for a single reason, but like marble fractured from within, resisting the eye, yet not time. What unfolded from the 3rd century after Christ was a slow and devastating transformation of the provinces, from loyal gears into centers of tension, rupture, and fragmentation. The empire, once centralized, began to be consumed from within, not by barbarian invaders, but by its own members. This rupture began with the crisis of the 3rd century, one of the most chaotic periods in Roman history. Between 235 and 284, Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise to the throne, most through military coups, assassinations, or acclamations by provincial legions. These were generals emerging from the frontiers, from the banks of the Danube, the Euphrates, and the Nile. Each represented was a part of the empire seeking to protect itself from imminent threats. Germans in the north, Sassanids in the east, and internal usurpers in the south. With political instability at the center, the provinces began to act independently, defending themselves, taxing themselves, even appointing their own Caesars. One of the most emblematic examples was the rise of the Gallic Empire, founded by Postumus in June 60. This alternative empire, centered in Trier, controlled not only Gaul but also Hispania and Britannia. It functioned as a replica of Rome, with a senate, coins, army, and imperial cult. It wasn't a barbarian secession. It was an attempt to save the idea of Rome where Rome could no longer reach. Meanwhile, in the east, the Palmyrene Empire emerged, led by Zenobia, a cultured and ambitious queen who extended her domain over Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. She too claimed the title of Augusta, minted coins with her effigy, and treated Palmyra as the new capital of an independent Eastern empire. These were not mere rebellions, they were structural responses to the collapse of central power. When Emperor Aurelian reconquered Gaul and Palmyra, he was hailed as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, but the wound had already opened. The empire was now increasingly reliant on military solutions, and each province placed less trust in Rome and more in itself. This process accelerated under the reign of Diocletian and his famed tetrarchy. To face the empire's immense scale and its many threats, Diocletian established a model in which four rulers, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, shared governance, each administering a region from different capitals, Nicomedia, Sirmium, Trier, and Mediolanum. The idea was to create a more agile, decentralized system with constant imperial presence across fronts. But in practice, it cemented on the mental and administrative division of the empire. There was no longer a single center. There were multiple Romes. The increasingly militarized and autonomous provinces began to develop local loyalties. Troops that once swore loyalty to the empire now saw themselves as defenders of Gaul, Dalmatia, or Syria. Regional elites gained power. Cities, once subordinate to Rome, became political hubs. Italy, once the empire's heart, lost relevance. Militarily vulnerable, economically weakened, and politically overshadowed by cities like Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Carthage. By the late 4th century, the empire was formally divided into East and West. The fall of Rome in Hari, 76, with the deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was merely the culmination of a process that had begun long before. The East, more urbanized, wealthier, and more stable, would survive for nearly 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The West fragmented into barbarian kingdoms, Gothic, Vandal, Frankish, Visigothic, many of which were direct heirs to the Roman provincial structure. The provinces that had upheld Rome for centuries now became the seeds of the medieval world. Their languages evolved into French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Their laws were reinterpreted, their roads still traveled, their buildings converted into churches and fortresses. Rome did not disappear. It dissolved into the veins of the provinces that had shaped it, and that, in turn, would shape the world. And before closing this journey, we must reflect on this immortal legacy of the Roman provincial model. For more than empires or ruins, what Rome left us was a way of organizing the world, power, cities, justice, and memory. That is what we will explore in the final dive of this series. Rome's legacy in the provinces, from antiquity to our own civilization. The empire had fallen, the standards had gone silent, the legions had departed or been absorbed into other armies. Cities were sacked, temples turned into churches, monuments reduced to ruins. But what Rome had built in the provinces did not vanish with the barbarians. It transformed, it reincarnated, it endured. Rome continued to live long after its fall. In the words we speak, the laws we follow, the maps we inherit, the gestures we repeat unknowingly. The Roman legacy in the provinces is not merely a memory. It is the invisible skeleton of Western civilization and part of the Eastern one as well. To understand this is to understand that Rome was never just a city, nor merely an empire. It was, and still is, a symbolic foundation of the modern world. When the empire's political structures collapsed in the West, the provinces became the new units of social organization. Visigothic kingdoms in Hispania, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa. Yet none of these barbarian peoples completely destroyed what they encountered. On the contrary, many preserved the Roman administrative structure, continued taxing, judging by Roman law, and building upon Roman cities. Latin remained the language of bureaucracy and the church. Roads still connected territories. The provincial divisions often became medieval dioceses and counties. Rome did not die, it changed its attire. In Gaul, Vulgar Latin evolved into French, but the legal code of Theodoric II, Visigothic king, was a direct adaptation of Roman law. In Italy, the Ostrogoths retained the Senate, public administration, and even the Roman calendar. In Hispania, Roman cities continued under Germanic kings who declared themselves heirs of Rome. And in North Africa, even under Vandal rule, prayers were still said in churches built by Roman emperors, and business was conducted in African Latin. Farther east, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, never ceased to see itself as Rome. Its citizens called themselves Romans, Romaei, spoke Greek, but maintained the same imperial structure, with provinces, censuses, taxes, and armies modeled on ancient traditions. Constantinople, the eastern capital, was built as a new Rome, complete with senate, hippodrome, palaces, and forums. For centuries, Byzantium resisted invasions, plagues, religious divisions, and Muslim forces, falling only in 423 with the Ottoman conquest. But even then, the echo of Rome endured. The sultans called themselves Caesars. Russian emperors adopted the title Tsar, derived from Caesar. The myth of Rome was transplanted onto other thrones, and in the cities of the West, Rome remained the ideal model of urban order. The grid layout, central forum, arches, and columns became references for Renaissance and modern architecture. Roman law was rediscovered and codified in medieval universities, especially in Bologna. and formed the foundation of the continental European legal systems, such as the French Civil Code and the Napoleonic Code, which directly influenced Latin America and many countries around the world. In other words, the laws that govern our contracts, our property, our inheritance, all still bear the mark of the Roman jurist. In religion, Rome's legacy intertwined with the Christian faith. The Catholic Church inherited the imperial structure, a supreme leader, the Pope in Rome, deliberative councils, an international bureaucracy, the Curia, and an official language, Latin. The very title, Pontifex Maximus, high priest used by emperors, was adopted by the popes. Civil basilicas became Christian basilicas. The Roman calendar was adapted for liturgical use. Many festivals, rites, and holidays are pagan echoes transformed. And what of the idea of Europe? The very notion that there exists a European civilization united by shared values, law, city, reason, writing, religion, is a direct inheritance from the Roman provincial model. Rome gave cohesion to the continent, connecting disparate regions through roads, aqueducts, coinage, and citizenship. Rome taught that politics could extend beyond bloodlines, that different peoples could be part of a single project if there was a shared structure. This idea would resurge in the Enlightenment, in the rise of nation-states, and later in the European Union, which chose as its symbol the Paestao golden star on a blue field, a reference to the Virgin Mary, but also to the universality that Rome once dreamed of, and even where Rome never reached, the Americas, Oceania, modern Asia, its influence was carried by European empires. The Latin American republics were inspired by Roman models of government. Capitals, senates, halls of justice, all of it is Rome reborn under new skies. The provinces of the Roman Empire were more than conquered territories. They were laboratories of civilization, paths of cultural fusion, schools of administration, cradles of faith and thought. And when Rome fell, it was within them that Rome remained. Because in the end, Rome was never just a place on the map. Rome was, and still is, a place in the mind, an ideal, a living memory, an invisible structure supporting the modern world. And thus, in the ruins of forgotten temples, in the languages we speak, in the laws we obey, and in the names we still carry, Rome lives. End of main script. Rome was not just an empire. It was a continuous pulse of wills, of symbols, of ideals that endure time like marble withstands the wind. Its provinces, scattered across deserts, forests, mountains, and rivers, were not merely stages of domination. They were communicating vessels of an imperial dream that still breathes between the lines of our civilization. Throughout these hours, we traveled millennia-old roads, entered forgotten cities, listened to the whispers of ancient tongues, and touched, with our eyes, the grand tapestry of Roman administration. We realized that Rome was never destroyed. It transfigured. In the universities that teach Roman law, in the languages descended from Latin, in the modern borders that still echo the ancient provinces, Rome still speaks, still walks, still watches us. And when the lights go out, and the modern world seems to collapse under its own speed, remembering Rome is to remember that even an empire can fall with elegance and leave roots so deep that they bloom millennia later. Rome left us more than columns and ruins. It gave us the skeleton of a world still trying to understand what it means to be civilized. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen, because between the sound of the rain and the silence of history, Rome still speaks.